The salt air of Charleston usually feels like home, but today, it tasted like justice. I sat in my car across the street from the Oceanview estate watching the final seal of the bank's foreclosure notice being slapped onto the mahogany front door. $5 million of arrogance stripped away in one afternoon. My phone buzzed on the dashboard, a text lighting up the screen from my mother. It read, "Reese, the bank took everything. We're on the street. I heard you just bought that luxury condo downtown. Send the keys over immediately. Family stays together in hard times, right?" I leaned back, a cold smile tugging at my lips. 3 years ago, these same people sold my entire future to fund my brother's ego, leaving me with nothing but a suitcase and a ruined credit score. Now they were looking at me as their personal lifeboat again. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't there to help them pack. I was there because I'm the one who owns the debt. I'm Reese. I'm 27 and I've spent every waking second since they disowned me, making sure that when their world finally collapsed, I'd be the one holding the deed. If this story resonates with you, or if you've ever been treated like an ATM by your own blood, hit like and subscribe. Only join us if you believe that loyalty is earned, not stolen. Drop your city and current time in the comments. I'm Reese, and this is how I took back my name. 4 years ago, my world didn't just crumble. It was stripped bare by the people I called my protectors. I was weeks away from graduating from the University of South Carolina, already envisioning my career in high-stakes finance. My grandfather had established an education trust fund specifically for my graduate studies and initial business capital, a sum of $120,000 that was supposed to be my launchpad. I remember sitting in our sun-drenched library in Charleston, logging into the portal with a sense of security, only to find a balance of zero. My heart didn't just skip a beat. It felt like it had been physically removed from my chest. I refreshed the page a dozen times, praying for a glitch, but the reality remained as cold and unyielding as the marble floors beneath my feet. I stormed into the dining room where my father, Warren Harrison, was casually sipping bourbon, while my mother, Beverly, flipped through a bridal magazine. When I demanded an explanation, Warren didn't even look up at first. He eventually set his glass down and calmly admitted that he had drained the entire account. He justified it by saying the family's high-end furniture business had hit a rough patch and needed an immediate cash infusion to stay afloat. However, the real blow came when Beverly excitedly pointed to a spread in her magazine mentioning the deposit they had just placed for my brother Duncan's wedding at an elite resort in the Hamptons. They hadn't just saved the business, they had liquidated my future to buy social status for their golden boy. That money was mine, Dad. It was legally designated for my education. I screamed, the betrayal burning in my throat. Warren stood up then, his face contorting into a mask of patriarchal coldness. He told me that a daughter's ambitions were secondary to the family's public image, and that Duncan, as the sole male heir, required a grand wedding to secure a merger with his fiancée's wealthy family. When I threatened to take legal action, the air in the room shifted. Warren crossed the floor and delivered a stinging slap across my face that echoed through the house. "You are just a girl, Reese." He spat, his voice trembling with a terrifying lack of remorse. "That trust fund belongs to the rightful heir of this legacy, and if you can't be a team player, you aren't part of this family." Beverly didn't move to comfort me. She simply looked away, more concerned about her magazine than her daughter's bruised cheek. Warren gave me exactly 30 minutes to pack. I walked out of that mansion with nothing but a single scuffed suitcase and a heart turned to stone, leaving behind the only life I had ever known. The neon lights of Atlanta were a far cry from the coastal charm of Charleston, but they provided the anonymity I needed to rebuild myself from the ashes. I secured an entry-level position at a premier asset management firm, transforming my anger into a cold, calculating work ethic that quickly caught the attention of the senior partners. For 3 grueling years, I lived a double life. By day, I moved millions of dollars for high-net-worth clients, but by night I retreated to a cramped studio apartment eating ramen and tracking every cent of my meager savings. I was a ghost in my own life, driven by a singular burning desire to never be vulnerable to the whims of others again. My self-imposed exile was interrupted by a series of frantic, tear-filled late-night phone calls from Beverly. She spun a harrowing tale of domestic tragedy, claiming that Warren's heart was failing under the stress of their collapsing business and that they were on the verge of losing everything. She begged for help, insisting that Duncan was working himself to the bone to save the furniture empire, but desperately needed liquid capital to cover emergency medical bills and payroll. Despite the sting of the past, the ingrained instinct to protect my family flickered back to life. I began wiring $2,000 every single month, money that represented my blood sweat and the very few comforts I allowed myself. I felt a sense of somber pride, believing that in their darkest hour, I was the one keeping the family afloat. The facade shattered during a weekend trip to visit my Aunt Margaret, the only relative who had bothered to send me a Christmas card after I was cast out. As I drove through the familiar oak-lined streets of our old neighborhood, I spotted a flash of crimson in the driveway of a high-end boutique. It was a brand-new Italian sports car, and stepping out of the driver's seat was Duncan, looking more pampered and arrogant than ever. Moments later, Beverly emerged from the store laughing as she swung several distinct orange shopping bags from a luxury French fashion house. There was no sign of a heart condition or a business in crisis, only the disgusting display of my hard-earned money being spent on Hermes silk and horsepower. "Mom, what is this?" I asked, stepping out of my car with a voice that felt like shattered glass. Beverly's face went pale for a split second before she plastered on a condescending smile. "Oh, Reese, darling, Duncan just needed a little boost for his morale, and your father's health has seen a miraculous recovery thanks to the specialized treatments we found. You should be happy, we're doing so well." In that moment, the last thread of daughterly devotion snapped. I wasn't their savior. I was their silent partner in a fraud I never signed up for. I realized that to them, my value was measured only in the decimal points I could provide. The rejection letter from the mortgage lender didn't just feel like a professional insult. It was a physical blow that left me reeling in the middle of a high-end Atlanta bank lobby. I had spent years meticulously managing every cent, believing my financial foundation was impenetrable. I was ready to purchase my first luxury condominium, a symbol of my independence, but the loan officer looked at me with a mix of pity and suspicion as he handed back my application. He informed me that my credit score, which should have been in the high 700s, had plummeted to a catastrophic 520. It was a death sentence in the world of finance, a mark of failure that threatened to undo every promotion and professional milestone I had fought so hard to achieve. Desperate for answers, I sought out Elliot Vance, a sharp-witted forensic accountant and lawyer who specialized in complex corporate fraud. We sat in his glass-walled office, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over piles of legal documents. As Elliot typed away, his brow furrowed, and a heavy silence filled the room. Finally, he turned the monitor toward me, revealing a tangled web of debt that I never authorized. I wasn't just a victim of a simple error. I was the primary co-signer for 3 massive business loans tied to my father's furniture empire. The total debt amounted to exactly $480,000, and every single one of those accounts was now 11 months past due. The realization hit me like a tidal wave of ice water. Warren Harrison hadn't just stolen my past with the trust fund. He had systematically sabotaged my future while I was still living under his roof. He had forged my signature on corporate loan documents, leveraging my clean credit history to prop up his failing business and Duncan's reckless spending. Because I was legally bound as a co-signer, the banks didn't care that I hadn't seen a dime of that money. In their eyes, I was just as responsible for the delinquency as my father. Elliot pointed to a specific clause in the contracts, his voice grim, as he explained that the lenders were already moving toward legal action against all parties involved. This is identity theft, Elliot. It has to be. I whispered, my hands trembling as I stared at the forged signatures that looked hauntingly like my own. Elliot shook his head slowly, explaining that in the eyes of the law, proving forgery within a family dynamic was a grueling uphill battle that could take years. My career as a wealth manager was built on the bedrock of financial integrity, and a 520 credit score made me a liability to my firm. If my employers found out that I was linked to nearly $500,000 in bad debt, I wouldn't just lose the condo, I would lose my livelihood. The man I once called my father had placed a financial noose around my neck, and the chair was about to be kicked out from under me. Anger is a volatile fuel, but when distilled through the cold lens of high finance, it becomes a surgical instrument. I realized that filing a police report against my own father would trigger a decade of messy litigation that I simply didn't have time for. Instead, I decided to play the game on the terrain where I was strongest and they were most vulnerable, the ledger. If Warren Harrison wanted to use my name to build a house of cards, I was going to be the one who bought the land underneath it and pulled the rug out from under his feet. With the strategic guidance of Elliot Vance and the unwavering support of Aunt Margaret, I began the quiet, methodical process of a hostile financial takeover from within my own bloodline. The first step was the formation of a private investment vehicle, a limited liability company I named Redwood Asset Group. The name was a tribute to the strength I had discovered in the shadow of my family's betrayal. To fund this offensive, Aunt Margaret provided the missing piece of the puzzle, a pristine, unencumbered deed to a prime coastal plot that our grandfather had hidden from Warren's greedy reach. This land, combined with the significant capital I had bled for during my years in Atlanta, gave Redwood the leverage it needed to negotiate with the banks. We weren't looking for a loan, we were looking for an acquisition. By this point, the Harrison furniture empire was hemorrhaging cash, and the regional banks were desperate to offload the toxic debt. My father's arrogance had led him to default on multiple commercial lines of credit and the Oceanview estate. The crown jewel of his vanity was already deep in the foreclosure pipeline. Redwood Asset Group moved like a predator in the night, approaching the secondary debt market with a series of aggressive bids. Because the banks viewed Warren as a lost cause, they were willing to sell the notes for 60 cents on the dollar just to get the liability off their books. I watched with a grim sense of satisfaction as Elliot finalized the paperwork that officially transferred the mortgage and the business liens to my company. The irony was delicious. Warren and Duncan were still strutting around Charleston, desperately trying to find a new lender to bail them out completely, unaware that their new master wasn't a faceless institution, but the daughter they had discarded like trash. Every time Beverly swiped her credit card for a lunch she couldn't afford, she was technically borrowing from my balance sheet. I was no longer the girl with the scuffed suitcase. I was the primary creditor of the Harrison family. I owned their home, I owned their business debts, and I owned the very ground they walked on. I spent the final nights before the eviction notice was served, reviewing the foreclosure statutes, ensuring every legal I was dotted and every T was crossed. I didn't just want my money back. I wanted to witness the moment they realized that the rightful heir they had sacrificed me for was a fraud, and the girl they dismissed was the only one with the power to decide if they slept under a roof or on the pavement. The humid Charleston air hung heavy over the driveway of the Oceanview estate as the finality of the situation began to set in. Two grim-faced officials from the sheriff's department stood near the mahogany entrance, clipboard in hand, overseeing the removal of a lifetime of unearned luxury. Warren Harrison was in the middle of a frantic red-faced tirade, gesturing wildly at a local bank representative while Beverly huddled nearby, clutching a designer silk scarf as if it were a lifebuoy. Duncan stood behind them, his shoulders slumped, and his eyes darting around in a pathetic display of helplessness, looking more like a frightened child than the rightful heir he was groomed to be. They were pleading for a grace period for one more week to find a miracle lender, unaware that the miracle had already passed them by weeks ago. I stepped out of my car, the sound of the door closing echoing like a gunshot through the driveway. The bank representative immediately straightened his tie and stepped toward me with a respectful nod. "Good afternoon, ma'am. We were just finishing the final inventory for Redwood Asset Group. Everything is in order for the formal transfer of possession." The silence that followed was absolute. Warren's jaw dropped, his gaze flickering between me and the official, unable to process the words. Beverly let out a strangled gasp, her eyes widening in a mixture of horror and dawning realization. "Reese, what are you doing here?" Warren finally stammered, his voice losing its thunder and cracking with desperation. "Did you come to help us tell these people who we are? Tell them this is a mistake?" I didn't say a word as I walked past him toward the front steps, my heels clicking sharply on the stone. I pulled a thick legal folder from my bag and handed it to the sheriff. Within those pages was the documented evidence of the cosigner fraud, the forged signatures on the business liens, and the final deed of the house that now legally belonged to my firm. "There's no mistake, Warren," I said, turning to face him. My voice was calm, devoid of the anger that had once consumed me. "Redwood Asset Group didn't just buy your debt. We bought your future. Every penny you spent on Duncan's wedding, every luxury car, every lie you told about your failing health, it's all recorded here in these defaults. You used my name to build this empire of fraud, so it's only fitting that my name is the one that brings it down." Beverly rushed forward, her face a mask of fake maternal grief, trying to grab my arm. "Reese, honey, you can't do this. We're your parents. Where are we supposed to go? You have that big condo. Surely we can just move in while we figure things out." I pulled my arm away, looking at her with an indifference that was colder than any scream. Behind her, Duncan finally found his voice, whining about his reputation and how he was supposed to run the family business. "The business is gone, Duncan. I closed the commercial lines of credit this morning," I replied, staring him down until he looked away. Then I turned my gaze back to my father. "You told me 4 years ago that a daughter's ambitions were secondary to the family's image. You told me that the trust fund belonged to the rightful heir. Well, Dad, you were right about one thing: investing in the family future is the most important thing. And as it turns out, I am that future. But there is no room for criminals or parasites in my legacy. You have 1 hour to take what fits in your car before I change the locks." I turned my back on their begging the same way they had turned their backs on me, and walked into the house that was finally truly mine. 1 year has passed since the dust settled on the Oceanview estate, and the landscape of Charleston looks remarkably different without the looming shadow of the Harrison name. The furniture empire that Warren Harrison spent decades building on a foundation of lies and stolen futures has officially ceased to exist. Following the hostile takeover by Redwood Asset Group, the business was liquidated to settle outstanding debts, leaving behind nothing but empty warehouses and a tarnished reputation. Warren is currently embroiled in a grueling civil lawsuit for financial fraud, his days of sipping expensive bourbon replaced by endless depositions and the harsh reality of a life he can no longer afford to outsource. The once glamorous Beverly now lives in a cramped 2-bedroom rental on the industrial outskirts of town, far from the social circles that once fueled her vanity. She spends her afternoons working as a part-time clerk at a local hardware store, her hands no longer clutching designer bags, but rather counting change for customers she once would have looked down upon. As for Duncan, the fallout was swift and merciless. When the money vanished, so did the loyal wife and the high society friends who only valued him for his last name. He is now a divorced middle-aged man living in his parents' basement, working manual labor jobs to pay off the gambling debts that finally caught up with him. They are a family united only by their collective failure, a bitter irony for people who once preached that family was their highest priority. As for me, I didn't stay in Charleston to gloat over their ruins. I sold the Oceanview property for a significant profit, liquidating every asset that tied me to that toxic ground. I took that capital back to Atlanta and became a senior partner at my firm, using the proceeds to launch an investment fund dedicated to supporting young entrepreneurs who lack the family safety net I was denied. I am no longer a daughter or a co-signer. I am a woman who built her own fortress. I made the conscious decision to block every phone number, email address, and social media profile associated with Warren and Beverly. I didn't do it out of anger, but out of a profound need for silence. My life is now filled with people who value me for my intellect and integrity, not for what I can provide on a balance sheet. The lesson I've learned is one I carry with me into every boardroom and every relationship. Favoritism and deceit can buy you a lavish wedding or a temporary facade of wealth, but they are bankrupt currencies when it comes to true loyalty. You cannot build a legacy by trampling on the very people who are supposed to be your foundation. To any parent who thinks they can sacrifice one child's future to polish the ego of another, let my story be your warning. A daughter's ambition is not a secondary resource to be mined. It is a force of nature that, when betrayed, will return to reclaim everything you stole. Never underestimate the child you tried to break. If you sharpen the blade through years of neglect and exploitation, don't be surprised when that same blade is the one that eventually severs the ties. I'm Reese, and I've learned that the greatest revenge isn't just winning, it's becoming so successful that you no longer care who lost. My name is now my own, my credit is impeccable, and my future is a blank check that I'm finally qualified to sign. The Harrison era is over, but my story is only just beginning.